Well, you know from my voice that I'm clearly not Mr. Bland, and I'm not going to be as funny as Mr. Bland, so I'll apologise for that now. But here's the first part of Lamia. We're looking at part 2, and it's the first in the series of lessons to help you really understand what's happening in the second part of the narrative. To begin with, click on the link on the PowerPoint so you can watch the opening of a quite long YouTube video, but it's just a really good reminder and summary of what happened in part 1 and also the key methods that Keats is using to narrate this poem. Listen to this, maybe add some additional notes to part 1 of your anthology if you're hearing things that you haven't considered before or have maybe missed in your annotations with Mr. Bland, and then when you are ready, join this screencast presentation back again and we'll take you through the opening of part 2. So to start off your annotations of part 2, I actually want to talk about the gap between part 1 and part 2 of the narrative. Part 1, obviously, we've had a lot of framing to the story, the introduction of the couple, the falling in love, and towards the end of part 1, Lamia has taken Lycius into the city of Corinth, past Apollonius they've hidden, and they've gone into this palace that she's created for them, a place where they can be hidden away from prying eyes and the busy world outside. This is their romantic idyll. And Keats is very much interested in a bower or an idyll, that place where lovers can go and they're free from conventions of normal society. It's their kind of fantasy world. What I find really interesting in this narrative is that we get the tiniest insight into what their life is like in this idyll. And this happens in at the start of part 1, but it's so brief. So we don't really get a sense of them as a couple at all. We get them falling desperately in love, we get them hiding away, and in part 2 it presents the downfall of their love. So structurally I think that's quite interesting that we never really get a focus on what their relationship was. So here's the opening stanza of part 2. Pause the video, have a read through it, and once you have read it through, I'll start to talk you through some key ideas. So pause the video now, read through, and then restart the video when you are ready. So this piece begins with an address by the omniscient narrator to us, to the reader. He's taking on not just the role of storyteller here, but he's kind of directly addressing us and telling us how to respond to the events that are going to be presented to us. And just as you will have noted in part 1, at moments he can take quite a cynical tone, and he does here. Here he talks about the nature of love between a couple, but he also addresses and personifies love. You've got the figure of Cupid here, or Eros, the Roman or Greek god of love. And he's looking at the nature of human love and how the gods and how they understand love and how that might impact on it. And what I really notice in the language here is he presents 2 different types of love. Love in a poor environment, love in a very rich environment. And perhaps in a more wealthy environment, love can flourish slightly more. However, look at the language: cinder, ashes, dust. Either is a grievous torment. It's that which will cause you trouble. And this is very much in keeping with Keats's style throughout the poem, the sense that you can feel a very deep love, but actually it can be unhealthy, it can cause pain, and regardless of the lifestyle that you are living, he kind of dismisses ultimately love. It is full of torture and suffering. And this is how he opens part 2. So we've had them secreted away, happy as anything. They've got their happily ever after moment if it was a fairy tale. And then part 2 reminds us that it is absolutely not. And then he continues this by focusing the narrative in on our couple, or on Lycius specifically. And look at this. Had Lycius lived to hand his story down, their bliss was too short. We've got the had, the but. So this is never going to happen. We've got prolepsis here, looking forward in the narrative, telling the reader this will not be a happy union. Their love will come to an end. And that's the passage of time. That's what naturally happens. I've been married many a year now, and as much as I love my husband, I'm sure he feels very differently about me now than he did 20 years ago when we got together. And that's what happens in human existence. That moment of real intense bliss can never last. On top of this, we have a besides. And this is when he kind of addresses again the love that he's personified here and back here. Love now has grown jealous of so complete a pair. And that line, I think, is quite an interesting one, or that little phrase. It shows Lamia and Lysias as a one and the same being. Their love has made them an absolute complete union, which I suspect makes the loss of that love, the separation of this pair later on in the narrative, even more tragic. But love is watching, hovering, buzzing with a fearful roar. All of this very animalistic, onomatopoeic imagery. I've also got that little link later on with the hiss, which I'll talk about. All suggests to us that actually, this love is going to be torn apart. There's going to be suffering involved in this. And love is just waiting and watching, but this union can never last. This links back to, as I say, this little word hiss, which reminds us of Lamia and her origins. And what I think is really interesting in this idea here is that their love was short, their bliss therefore always existed. Time never happened or never kind of eroded the relationship, so there was never distrust and hate in this relationship that would make Lamia's soft voice hiss, that would turn her into a shrew-like figure that we often get in literature. That doesn't happen here. And so we get the sense that this is a perfect moment for them, but it is going to be absolutely torn apart. So if nothing else, this is a key quotation to remember for this poem, the union between Lamia and Lysias. They are one and the same thing. If anyone's seen the film Jerry Maguire, it's a concept that is often repeated in kind of romantic stories. Watch Jerry Maguire if you haven't. It's a beautiful, beautiful story to watch during lockdown. But the idea of what each of them completing one another is central to their relationship. Yet the opening of the next stanza begins with this very ominous, full of foreboding phrase: "For all this came a ruin." Keats is really intruding on the narrative here, directing the reader. There is going to be an absolute destruction of their relationship. And so, as I said at the start, this very brief moment in the middle when they are so complete a pair is not going to last, and it is going to be over so incredibly quickly. And this ties us in with one of the key debates in tragedy. Where does the fault lie? Is it the fact that the tragic heroes are self-destructive, or is it fate taking control? Pause the video and just have a quick read of the information on this slide, and then restart when you're ready. So here you have an image of the Greek goddesses, the three goddesses of fate, and in their hands they're playing with the thread of life. And it's this idea that from kind of Greek and Roman mythology, that there are these figures in control of all of the choices that we make, and anything that happens to us in our lives is without any kind of disruption from us. We simply have to submit to the will of fate. Well, clearly in this narrative, Lamia has not submitted to this, even though she's this mythical being. Gods and humans were still bound by the same kind of code in relation to the fates in Greek and Roman mythology. She has challenged her position, and perhaps there is a sense of the fact that she's gone against the status quo. Perhaps that's the fault of her decision-making process. However, we also see through part 2 of the narrative Lysias, and again he has turned away from what his role was set out for, this scholar, this student of Apollonius, and he has secreted himself away in this palace with Lamia and to enjoy the life of love, and he's turned away from that. And so is it a sense that in turning away from your path, you are always going to have fate come and take control, and a series of unstoppable events will happen and you will be destroyed? But we know that with tragic heroes that they do have some kind of flaw. They make decisions, they make wrong decisions, they have errors of judgment. And Keats also presents this to us in part 2 of the narrative. And so as we start to read on into this next stanza, it's been set up as stanza 2 of part 2. This is not going to last. Let's have a look at how Keats starts to introduce to us these decisions, these personal decisions that the characters are making, which result in this chain of unstoppable events. And that's what we'll be annotating the next section for. So here is the next stanza. Read it through, pause the video whilst you're doing it. You might read it through a couple of times. Don't worry about understanding every single word. I don't. But once you are ready and once you've got a sense of what you think might be happening, restart the video and listen again so that you're ready to annotate. So we've already talked about the opening line of this stanza. From here, follows a description of Lamia and Lysias in the palace that she has created for them. They are side by side. Remember, they're so perfect a pair together. And Keats tells us about how they're enthroned. He talks about the couch that they're in, the curtain around it, the stringing from the room. We've got all of these architectural images. This is Keats reminding us that Lamia has created this world for them. Remember, this is their romantic bower, their secret idyll. It's a product of her magic. But we also know that these things can never last, and a lot of Keats's poetry is about the opposition between the imagination, which she has created here. She has created an imaginary world where they will be safe, and the normal, the everyday, the quotidian life. And this is what then intrudes here. We have this really key moment, the thrill of the trumpets, which is from the outside world, a noise which brings Lysias' consciousness away from a world of imagination to the world outside. And whilst the sounds don't last long, the sounds leave a thought in his head, and it's buzzing, humming away, constantly there, reminding him of what lies beyond this world of imagination. And so again, we've got this key opposition. Lamia's desire to be happy away from prying eyes, and Lysias, a member of the world, and knowing that he has turned his back on that, and he wants to know for the first time, again an interesting kind of time signal there, for the first time that he harbours himself away in this palace of sweet sin. Goodness knows what's happening in there. His spirit, his consciousness goes beyond that world and into the noisy world, the real world, which he'd almost given up, but not quite. So here we've got the threat. And again, this always happens in Keats' poetry. There is a threat from the reality against the imagination. And Lamia notices this, and she sees it with absolute pain, because she thinks it's suggested that she is not enough for him. He wants something more. And how many a woman has thought that about the men in their lives? You know, where are they spending their time? Am I not enough for them? And the joys that she can offer is still not enough. And what I think is really fascinating here is that whilst, Lamia's background is this snake, she is touchingly human here in the concerns that she has. She is so worried about him turning away from her. And she knows that he is musing, thinking beyond her. And key line here, a moment of thought is a passing bell, a death bell. And so she is absolutely acutely aware in this opposition between idealism and imagination. There is this cold, hard reality, thought, thinking, knowing. And that thought, thinking, knowing will destroy passion. And this absolutely ties us with the world of Romanticism. And I know you've talked about this in relation to Keats, this battle, this conflict between cool objectification and measurement and desire and passion and heat. And here you've got a picture of one of William Blake's engravings. Here's Isaac Newton measuring the world, that cold rationality, and he's ignoring all of the beauty of nature that is behind him. He's turned his back on it. And this is what we're getting here with Lysias. He is turning his back on this world to focus in on this one. So that's the opening two stanzas of part 2. Well worth spending time on, because Keats is setting up for us. This is not going to end happily, and we as readers know this. We can watch, we can look at, kind of listen to the decisions, watch the scenes unfold before us and know where they're making mistakes. What I find really fascinating, though, is that Lamia of part 1 seems to have been, it has been forgotten as well. The Lamia that we're getting introduced to in part 2 is almost absent in these opening two stanzas. We've got the outside world, we've got Lamia. So to kind of bring your thinking to a close and start to really focusing on the characterisation of Lamia, quickly read my summary of the different positions she occupies in part 1. And once you've done this, what do you make of her in part 2? I'm only suggesting you write 100 words. It's not very much, 6-8 lines maximum. But how is Keats developing her character? Because I don't think we're getting all of this coming through. I think we're getting a slightly different version of Lamia, and perhaps that's part of the tragedy of the poem. Remember, your tragic hero loses their identity. She has many identities in part 1. What identity is she gaining in part 2? Once you've done that, send that to your teacher so they can see your thoughts on your reading. Hope you enjoy. And I'll see you for the next lesson shortly.